Hi everyone, my name is Ayla Barutchu and I'll be hosting this masterclass for today. Okay, so I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay respects to our elders, past, present and emerging. We extend our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today, and I'm here on the Wadawurrung people's lands on the Kulin Nation. Thank you. Okay, just some housekeeping for today's masterclass. Can you please ensure that you are on mute? And please use the Q&A box for any questions during the masterclass. You'll find it in the bottom right corner. You'll see 3 dots. If you press on there, you will see Q&A. So please put any questions in the chat box, please. And if you have questions at the end of the seminar, also please feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions. Thank you. The aim of the Masterclass series is to share best practice, tools and knowledge to support the information development of clinical trial networks. To date, we've already had a masterclass on establishing clinical trial networks and governance. Today, we have the pleasure of Jennifer and Nisha talking to us about different funding mechanisms, which I'm sure we'll find very useful in our endeavours. And moving forward, we're looking forward to having masterclasses on consumer involvement and industry engagements. So this session will cover what clinicians, researchers, managers need to know about funding mechanisms of clinical trial networks. Thank you. Okay, so firstly, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Jennifer Thompson, who holds a Master's in Health Policy and is an experienced leader in research operations with a career that spans industry, university, healthcare, and non-for-profit management teams at ANZUP since mid-2023, working to ensure ANZUP's research projects are efficient with high level of oversight, adherence to regulatory and government requirements. I also have the pleasure of introducing you to Nisha Berthon-Jones, who has a background in medical science and business and has extensive experience in managing and improving research operations. At AGITG, Nisha oversees a robust portfolio of clinical trials engaging with international oncology groups and pharmaceutical and biotech industry and facilitating the development and implementation of research strategies. She has been instrumental in driving strategic initiatives to enhance treatment and quality of life for patients with GI cancers. Thank you both. And now I'll hand it over to Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer.
Hello, everybody. As has already been said, I'm Jennifer Thompson. I'm the Clinical Trials Operations Manager at ANZUP, which is the Australian and New Zealand Urogenital and Prostate Cancer Trials Group. Today, I'm going to be covering our introduction, move into my own case studies from ANZUP, and then Nisha will take over and talk about AGITG and their funding mechanisms. So we'll be covering why do we need funding, what the funding mechanisms in Australia are that both of our groups use, the funding mechanism tools, case studies, and at the end, I think has already been mentioned, there's a Q&A session. So why do we need funding? We need funding to sustain our organisations. We need funding to support our staffing, and we need funding to support research across the areas of urogenital and prostate cancer and also gastrointestinal cancers and all of the other cancers that our collaborative cooperative research groups work across. There's a long list of funding mechanisms in Australia. So we have listed just what we think is the majority of them. So there's Cancer Australia infrastructure grants, there's philanthropy, there's fundraising, federal and state government research grants and targeted funding rounds, international research grants, trusts and foundation grants, patient support group grants, corporate sponsorships, and so many more that you can see there. And so if we move to the next slide, and the next one again. So in terms of our groups, our collaborative cancer clinical trials groups, A main source of funding for all of us at this point is Cancer Australia. Cancer Australia provides us, through targeted grant funding rounds at regular intervals, infrastructure funding for research development activity, so protocol development. It supports multi-site collaborative cancer clinical trials groups to develop industry-independent cancer clinical trial protocols, so that we're not dependent on pharmaceutical industry or any other industry for providing funding that would influence what trials we run. The funds that we are provided by Cancer Australia under this scheme provide for technical services as well. So there's health economics services, there's statistical services, psycho-oncology, etc., etc. And you can see there an excerpt from the website for Cancer Australia. You can search for the cancer through the Cancer Australia website for more information about which collaborative research centres are currently funded and how you can apply for funding. And you can see that the primary aim of funding is to increase the number of cancer clinical trials conducted in Australia, increase participation in clinical trials by people affected by cancer, increase the number of clinical sites actively participating in cancer clinical trials, and increase the involvement of policymakers, clinicians, researchers, and consumers in the development of cancer clinical trials. So essentially, we want to increase everything that we can to help improve care and outcomes for people with cancer across Australia. Next slide, please. In terms of some of our major fundraising avenues or tools that we use that are outside of grants, one of the major ones can be philanthropy. So philanthropy can be defined as major gifts or bequests or regular giving. And then we also have fundraising. So we have community fundraising activities. We are involved in things like City to Surf. ANZUP currently has a 111 Your Way campaign running, which I'll talk to later. We can run appeals throughout the year. So particularly at tax time or at Christmas, we can qualify prospects and build key relationships in order to fundraise. We can undertake direct marketing activity. We can have funds raised through member referrals, through in memoriam programs, or through regular smaller amounts of giving. Next slide, please. In terms of grants, there are some very common grants that I'm sure the majority of people who are signed in today are very aware of, particularly our federal government grants through the NHMRC. So things like the Clinical Trials and Cohorts Study grants that all closed for submissions last week, investigator grants, early career researcher grants, and then the MRFF, Medical Research Future Fund grants. So they support things like international clinical trial collaborations and individual clinical trials activities. There are state government grants available through institutions or state institutions like Cancer Institute New South Wales or Cancer Council Victoria. There's international research grants, things like the Collaborative Group of the Americas on Inherited Gastro-Intestinal Cancers that is available out of the USA. There are foundations and patient support organisations that do provide funding for clinical trials here in Australia. Foundations like Ramsay Health, Prostate Cancer Foundation Australia, so PCFA, Perpetual, Tour de Cure, Sydney Children's Hospital Foundation, Bowel Cancer Australia, and Rare Cancers Australia. Next slide, please. In terms of industry and other sources of funding, there's biopharmaceutical medical device industry partners that the majority of our collaborative research groups have relationships with. So they can provide funding for us or provision of in-kind product, whether that be drugs or medical devices that we want to utilise in our clinical trials. We can use reserves from completed trials in some cases to support future trials. We can generate investment income. By virtue, we are not-for-profit, but we can generate investment income, and we can generate income from running of our annual scientific meetings. Some groups choose to do this, and some groups don't choose to create income through that avenue. Next slide, please. So now we've got a couple of case studies. I'm going to be speaking in terms of ANZUP, and then Nisha will speak in terms of AGITG. And there's my intro slide again. So ANZUP came into being in 2008. Since then, we've had over 8,000 participants enrolled across 33 national and international clinical trials. Our trials have resulted in life-improving and changed practice outcomes for those affected by what we call below-the-belt cancers. So those are those urogenital and prostate cancers. Nearly 35,000 Australian people, and over 5,500 in New Zealand, are diagnosed with a below-the-belt cancer every year. So that's 111 people every day across Australia and New Zealand diagnosed with a below-the-belt cancer. Here in ANZUP, we have a philanthropy and business manager. He has kindly provided me with his visual that explains the difference, I guess the pathway to awareness, through awareness, fundraising and philanthropy that here at ANZUP we use. So we have objectives like raising awareness, informing and educating, exciting and inspiring. We have channels like media, social media and events. And we have our key players that are involved in those. So that's to raise awareness of below-the-belt cancers and the fact that ANZUP exists. Then we move into our fundraising, I guess you'd call it strategy. So this is where we want to uncover donor interests, we want to draw people closer, and we want to start conversations. We do this by running community fundraising and community events, by having a digital strategy, by having an ambassador program, and that involves our marketing and communications team, our CEO, and all of us here at ANZUP. Essentially, there's a pathway from fundraising to philanthropy, which I explained earlier can be defined as larger donations that come in. So again, we want to strengthen connections, deepen dialogue, target conversation, and that can lead us into philanthropy, where we invite commitment, recognise and steward philanthropy donors, and leverage to champagne the campaign. So that's where we're looking at bringing in funds to improve care for people with the cancers that we are looking into and making discoveries in, from major donors, strategic partners, and gifts and wills. So next slide, please. So in terms of a fundraising example or case study, I think I mentioned earlier, 111 people diagnosed every day with a below-the-belt cancer. So ANZUP currently has a fundraising activity that opened a couple of days ago, and it's there to support people like me, like you, who want to contribute, but we don't have millions and billions of dollars to contribute. We want to do something in our own small ways. So our 111 Your Way is a activity where you can sign up via a web-based sign up page, and you can choose to do in October whatever you want to do 111 times. So one time for every person that's diagnosed on just one day in October. So for me, I've signed up. I do go to the gym usually try to get there about 3 times a week. And I'm going to be doing 111 kilometres on my gym bike in October. So yeah, that's one way that we can raise funds, and we can all have a bit of fun, get fit for summer, whatever it is that you want to do. Our CEO has been saying he's going to be baking, or our chair has been saying that he's going to be baking 111 cupcakes, or maybe it was that he was going to be eating 111 cupcakes. So next slide, please. So now I'll get into something a little more serious. So our clinical trial funding. So we have a clinical trial that has been open. It's called the Climate Study. All of our trials have fancy numbers or not so fancy numbers. So this is ANZUP 1906 that tells you that it initially was conceived in 2019. It's a clinical trial using a novel biomarker to identify minimal residual disease in people with stage 1 testicular cancer. The aim of it is to demonstrate clinical utility of that specific novel biomarker in detecting residual disease in men following orchidectomy for that stage 1 testicular cancer. We have a target of 200 participants, and we currently have 142 participants enrolled across Australia and New Zealand. We've got 11 sites open in Australia and 1 in New Zealand. So we need to cover costs. We needed to raise funds to be able to run this study, which is an investigator-initiated study. The costs that we needed to cover are listed there: coordination, site and per participant site payments, lab kits, cryovials, storage boxes, costs for assays, clinical trial insurance and indemnity, database development, HREC fees, meetings, publication costs, etc. The required budget to be able to run our study was between 350,000 and 500,000 Australian dollars, which in the realms of a clinical trial is not a huge budget, but is still a lot of money. So how do we fund this trial? It's relatively small. It wasn't going to attract NHMRC or MRFF funding, and it didn't have pharmaceutical company support. Next slide, please. So this is what we did. It's been funded in 3 different ways. So it's funded partly by an ANZUP small grant. So we do fundraise during the year to enable us to facilitate small grants up to the value of $50,000 each. It's called our Below the Belt Research Fund. So this particular trial, Climate, was a recipient of that Below the Belt Research Fund. So that gave $50,000 into the trial, at least the startup phases, the initial phases of it. And then we also funded this trial through using ANZUP discretionary funding, and that's the funding that came from our philanthropy and fundraising endeavours. And then the third avenue that's funded into this is direct investigator funding. So this is where our investigators, who are all very invested in the clinical trials, our members across Australia, they sometimes have access to local health district or university internal grants. They sometimes have bequests that come to them through their work that they're allowed to use for further work or similar. So that's how we funded this trial in 3 different ways, but none of them were major funding avenues like national, state grants or anything like that. And what I really want to point out to all of you, and I think is really important to understand, is that all 3 of those avenues of funding that fed into our climate study, they're all consumer involvement funding. So they're all very much facilitated by consumer and community engagement with ANZUP. Our small grants below the belt, there's fundraising that raises those funds. Our discretionary funding, it's philanthropy. that's community and consumer involvement. And at the investigator funding, that's also community involvement and support. So can we move to the next slide? I'm going to finish up because I've covered fundraising and other ways that we support our trials. And Nisha is going to take over from me now. I think I'm just about on time. Nisha's going to take over from me now, and she's going to talk about other ways that AGITG and sometimes ANZUP fund our trials as well.
Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me okay, Sarah or Ayla?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So hi everybody, I'm Nisha Berthon-Jones. I'm Head of Research Operations for the Australasian Gastro-Intestinal Trials Group. So we are the GI cancer group. If you could please move to the next slide. Thank you. Essentially, we are another multidisciplinary collaborative clinical trials group, and we've been around since 1991, and the focus being to develop research and improving outcomes for people with gastrointestinal cancers. There are 11 different types of cancer types that are associated with the digestive system, from the cancer of the esophagus to anal cancer, as well as gastrointestinal stromal tumours and neuroendocrine tumours. And from a fundraising perspective, it has been a little bit challenging because there are 11 different cancers. So I will get to it a little bit later, but just wanted to flag that there. We have, so AGITG incorporated as a company limited by guarantee back in 2000. And we also have a philanthropic arm or a community division, which is called the GI Cancer Institute. And the GI Cancer Institute works across Australia to raise funds and awareness of GI cancer and our research. And we have a fundraising team that supports the activities that are led by the GI Cancer Institute. Thanks, Sarah. This is just a little snapshot of our membership. We have a diverse membership of over 1,800 people across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, including specialties such as oncologists, surgeons, scientists, nurses, allied health professionals, biostatisticians, research staff, and we have a very active community advisory panel as well. And we engage the members and including our CAP to be involved in our fundraising activities. Thanks, Sarah. Next slide, please. And over the last 30 years, we have developed and conducted 83 research studies involving over 9,400 patients around the world, including 181 research articles and 256 presentations. Next slide, please. And from a global footprint perspective, we have roughly 285 sites worldwide, and we build new collaborative relationships and strengthen existing connections with international trials groups based in North America, Brazil, Ireland, Germany, Taiwan, Singapore, and Malaysia. And from a funding perspective for our trials, where we are pursuing grant-funded studies, those countries that are involved will need to secure local funding to support the conduct of the study within their country, covering coordination costs and site payments and things like that. This is our research development and prioritization framework, which we're very proud of. This has been developed over the last 3 years, and we have various research committees and board committees included on this graphic. Essentially, this is the process we cover for every single new concept that gets presented to our working parties or translational research committee. But from a budget and funding perspective, the study budget and funding source is identified during this middle panel, the blue panel, and the board committees are involved if access to philanthropic funding is required. And at the end of the day, the scientific advisory committee will determine whether the concept should progress from a prioritization perspective. Next slide, please. Thank you. So from an AGITG perspective, these are all of our funding models as it currently stands. There are 13. I won't cover things that have already been discussed and raised by Jenn. If we go to the next slide. So the GI Cancer Institute, as I said, is our philanthropic arm, and it's been around for the last 13 years. We have raised over $12 million supporting over 28 research projects during this time. And the main types of philanthropic funding so far has been through major gifts and regular giving activities. Next slide, please. Thank you. And from a fundraising perspective, these are all the activities that, or programs rather, that the fundraising team initiate. The community fundraising events like City to Surf, Golf Day, there's a member that makes jam. There's also the regular appeals that we do throughout the year, tax and Christmas time, direct marketing. Member referrals is something that we're really trying to initiate. Given the 1,800 or odd members that we have, this is a huge there's huge potential for us to engage the members, to refer potential patients or carers that wish to donate to GI cancer research. So that's something that our new philanthropic manager will be pursuing when she starts next week. We also have an in memoriam program, a bequest program, and a Gutsy Challenge program. And the Gutsy Challenge program is actually for our one-day Gutsy Challenges anyway. The whole staff have been involved on an annual basis. So it's been a bit of a team building event as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. I just wanted to touch on our process with regards to accessing philanthropic funds for research. Obviously, there's huge interest in utilising this with these reserves. However, we do have a process in place, and our finance committee, our fundraising committee, and the board review the case for support and make a recommendation. And some of the things that the committees consider includes the fundraising strategy, whether there's potential for donor interest for the identified research project, whether there are existing donations reserves for that particular tumour type. And I said, there are 11 tumour types that we cover, and so for the most part we do have a donation reserve that's attached to that particular tumour type. We need to consider whether there are other studies with committed philanthropic funding, because then those studies are prioritised. We need to consider the capacity of the fundraising program and the current resourcing. And some of the things, one of the things that really do matter from a fundraising perspective is also the study chair's engagement or the potential engagement with regards to supporting fundraising campaigns, the size of their network and their ability to fundraise. And to date, our study chairs that have been involved in major donor campaigns and things like that have been amazing and really helpful. And there's also the opportunity cost of committing to the trial or the research project that needs to be considered. And we do need to be able to report back to the donors. So these are just a snapshot of the things that the board subcommittees have to consider. Next slide, please. From a grants perspective, AGITG obtained the MRFF eligible organisation status in January last year, and then the NHMRC administering institution status in July, so last couple of months ago. And this has enabled us to broaden our capacity to seek additional funding. Prior to January 2023, the administering bodies that we utilised were either the university attached to the study chair, or the coordinating centre, perhaps they had those rights. But now we are definitely going through our internal resourcing to support these grant applications. And aside from the government grants and the state-based grants, we've also tried to source funding through an international research grant. However, that was unsuccessful. And the patient support organisations are also an avenue, depending on the type of concept, the budget, and things like that. Next slide, please. In terms of other financial sources, there's obviously the pharmaceutical industry support and the corporate sponsorship avenue. And we also have some reserves from the completed trials. So as I said, we've been around for 30 years. And so some of the trials have had some reserves that could be utilised to support other trials with deficits, for example. And there's also investment income and the income generated from the ASM. One of the things that we don't do is the membership fee, whereas some other groups do that. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share some learnings, given the all of the changes that we've sort of undergone over the last few years. The study budget is, the way the study budget is developed is absolutely crucial to how the study is obviously funded and to what capacity, and to ensure that the deficits that are generated at the end are minimal. So we undertook a revision of our study budget development policy last year, and really tried to ensure that all the activities that come under the role of the legal sponsor is included. So now we have a more robust method of generating these study budgets. And what was also evident was that there was a need for education and training across all of our research committees and board committees as to what needs to be in the study budget, and that reflects the roles and responsibilities, particularly GCP sponsor obligations and sponsor oversight activities. And I just wanted to also flag that from a grants perspective, yes, we've now got the administering institution status. However, what was quite evident was that we need to make sure that there's sufficient resourcing to support the need to support to submit grants. So we have one staff member that's qualified and skilled to, develop the grants and do the compliance checks and all of that. And what's been evident is that we actually do need, it has to be a proper strategy for the preparation and management of these grants and what kind of service we're trying to provide to members. And so we've sort of developed that in the last few months, also including the various models that the grants could sit under. So that was another learning, and we are now in the process of probably recruiting another person in the near future to support this new service delivery. I think that was my last slide. Ayla, will you be covering this summary key messages?
I think that was you and me, Nisha.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so essentially funding is essential to be considered carefully and early on. It needs to be integrated with an organisation's culture, and a one-size approach doesn't fit everything. Planning for sustainability of funding is critical as well. So hence our need to develop the budget policy to reflect all of the activities that we currently undertake on behalf of a study. The consumers, community, and other key stakeholders are key to funding sustainability, and funding a clinical trial may involve bringing together multiple stakeholders. So I think at the end of the day, collaboration is key, and pursuing every opportunity is also helpful if the resourcing allows.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. The only thing I have to add to that would be to say that funding is an ongoing challenge for most of us, and I can't think of a more valuable topic. And thank you so much for your presentations. That was so valuable, I think, to all of us, both Nisha and Jennifer. So I'd like to open the floor to questions. Do we have any questions? Please feel free to raise your hands or write your questions in the chat box. I don't see any hands up, but while we're waiting, I do have a question, and that is to sort of inquire more about the traditional mode of funding through NHMRC and MRFF. I'm just wondering, you do apply, I know that you mentioned that about AGITG, that you do apply for MRFF funding or NHMRC funding. I'm just wondering, what is your success rates with these funds? And just to add to that as well, just as an estimate, what proportion of your funding does that contribute? Like it comes from MRFF or government versus philanthropy? So there are two questions bundled in one for both of you.
Good question.
I can answer maybe the first bit. So I know Nisha spoke to AGITG participating and able to apply for NHMRC grants. ANZUP can't. We have not applied to be an administering organisation for NHMRC grant funding, which means that we need to partner if we are going to apply for those. So I mentioned earlier that last week was the closing of the clinical trial and cohort studies grants submissions. ANZUP was partnered into 4 submissions this year into that mechanism of funding. And we partnered with 3 different academic institutions across those 4 applications that we were partnered into. We last year were involved in 8 partnered applications for MRFF and or NHMRC grants, although we can actually apply for MRFF grants and be the eligible organisation holding the funds. If that's awarded ourselves, we can't for NHMRC. But last year we partnered into 8. One of those was successful, and it was one of only 2 oncology grants awarded in the NHMRC category of grant applied for. So, you know, the success rate, as I'm sure many of the people who are dialed into this today for our federal grants through those programs, is quite small. It's something between 5 and 8% of those who apply are successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was the second part of your question, Ayla?
That kind of answers it, perhaps. I was just wondering what proportion of your funding comes from government or philanthropy, or through NHMRC versus philanthropy or fundraising?
For ANZUP, honestly, the federal grant funding is, you know, probably quite a small part of the funding that feeds into what we've currently got 24 active research projects through startup through to closing out, and those federal grants would be the minimum, you know, not really providing much into those. I don't know about you, Nisha.
I think, good question, because I hadn't really done any graphs or anything for that response, but majority of our funding, I think there's stages as well. It depends so much on the GI cancer, well, for us, GI cancer landscape. So over the years, there's been a change in funding strategies, and hence our recent change to have a grant strategy. So certainly over the last 10 years, majority of it has been through industry funding. And whilst we also partner with universities and so on in previous years to pursue NHMRC and MRFF grants, the success rates have still been very low. And there's, you know, multiple rounds that need to be undertaken in order to secure funding through the grant schemes. And there's a cost to that as well, because it's time spent preparing that grant. And for our grant strategy, we did see that it costs roughly $15,000 to submit a government grant based on time spent by our grant developer, who's also our translational research lead. So it's a costly exercise. If you can figure out the best concepts that are likely to secure funding through the grant schemes, then your likelihood is probably going to increase. And that's something that we're trying to ensure that the grants that are submitted are appropriate and are likely to be funded. But yes, we've definitely seen a reduction in industry funding for our trials from our pharmaceutical partners through the investigator-initiated, portals that they have available. And that's probably due to the change in pipeline, the clinical development pipeline through the companies as well.
Okay. So your main funding then is through industry, then philanthropy, and then grant. That would be fair to say.
Yeah, so it was through industry, and it's probably now switching to grant and philanthropy. Yeah.
Grant and philanthropy. Okay, thank you. Sorry, can I just with ANZUP similarly, do industry contribute much to you as well?
Historically, yes. We've had very good relationships with the pharmaceutical and product partners that have products in the urogenital and prostate cancer space. So yes, traditionally that has been a major source of funding for some of our clinical trials. But as Nisha has said, it really depends on the landscape and the appetite of those partners for funding trials in Australia and New Zealand. And, the landscape of clinical trials across the world is that sometimes it's easier if a company is based in Europe for them to fund trials that are in Europe. And also there's the tyranny of distance. So while they may be enthusiastic and wanting to support trials in Australia, sometimes the tyranny of distance for transportation of product, whether that be device or drug, can also be a barrier for us in those partnerships.
Yeah. I don't see, I'm not sure if I'm not seeing the questions, but I don't see any questions in the Q&A section.
I can see one in the chat.
Yeah, I'm trying to open the chat itself. Oh, here we go. Sorry. You're welcome to, I'm trying to open them.
I can read it out if you like.
Yeah.
It comes from Samantha Oakes, who happens to be my CEO. The question is actually for Nisha. She first said, Nisha, Jenn, great talk. And then she says, Nisha, you said that your membership has been very fruitful in helping with philanthropy. However, do you see burnout through your membership for fundraising for annual challenges? And are there challenges with approaching participants via PIs who are on active treatment?
Thanks, Sam. I think, yes, we probably are seeing some burnout from the members that have always participated in our Gutsy challenges and community fundraising activity. And this is something that needs to be regenerated given the size of the membership. So there's probably a lot of other members that we can approach versus the ones that have always been involved and engaged. And to your second question, are there challenges with approaching participants via peers who are inactive? Yeah, so essentially people that the member referrals are coming from people that aren't on our trials. They are other patients or carers that want to fund GI cancer research. So to date, the donations we've received so far are not from trial participants. Hope that answers your question. But this is something we have had a few occasions now, and from our members that have been able to refer patients, like their patients or carers that have wanted to donate to GI cancer, and it's been quite significant, the amount of funds that they were able to or were willing to donate. So this is why we think that there's a space from a program perspective for our members to be educated on this opportunity if they wanted to assist. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisha. Anyone else have any other questions, like to raise their hand or put in the chat or the Q&A section? I've got a few more, but I don't want to hog it either. I'm just wondering, with the philanthropy, if you want to get started, like to do serious philanthropy, how much investment do you need to start put in to start with?
I think you need to invest in your internal resource.
Okay.
We have a philanthropy manager who provided me with the pretty picture I put up earlier. And I think if you really want to develop a relationship with the types of people and entities that can provide major funding like that, then you really need someone who has a skill in doing that and experience and can focus on doing that. What about you, Nisha?
100%, Jen. I was absolutely going to say you need your own fundraising support with the relevant set of skills and experience to know how to go about setting things up and engaging those companies from a corporate sponsorship perspective as well.
Yeah. And I think because, you know, like we're a not-for-profit, we're not a big team. There's something like 13 people in our team. So it's relatively small, and that's, you know, a 6-member clinical trials team. And we have a communications manager, the business and philanthropy manager, the CEO, you know, so it's a small team. I'm a clinical trials operations manager. I'm not a philanthropy gatherer. That's not my skill set. So, you know, bringing in philanthropy, it really is a skill set.
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. So we have another question from Archana. Nisha, great talk. Once again, compliments. When you push back on overheads for institutions, do you get pushback, especially if the funding of the clinical trial is coming from pharma companies? If so, how do you handle those pushbacks? Another great question.
Yeah. So I suppose the overheads from institutions, so yes, it's a lot harder to negotiate costs to be reduced if the funding is coming from pharma. If it's grant funded or philanthropically funded, it's much easier to reduce those overheads. And I think that was the other reason that we sort of decided to make the change to provide resources internally to support grant applications, because we don't have those levels of overheads that the universities do. So the cost saving is there because we're submitting or administering the grants through AGITG now. However, in the past, that wasn't the case, and you know, the overheads can be up to 30%. So yeah, so I think that's one of the main reasons that we've decided to undergo explore or implement this grant strategy, and hopefully we'll benefit out of it. And as I said, we only started last year. We submitted 2 MRFF grants last year, of which 1 was fully funded. So at that stage, it was 50% success rate. This year we've submitted, I think 5 grants so far to the MRFF and the NHMRC. We haven't received any outcomes as yet. And so we shall wait and see. Yeah.
And I think from the ANZUP perspective, you know, we have previously used a model because we are a very small team. In fact, ANZUP started with just the CEO and an administration person. And when it started, did not have the capacity to run and coordinate the clinical trials themselves. So we partnered with universities that would undertake the coordination aspect of those trials. And as Nisha has said, you know, the overheads that can come with that can be quite steep. And so, you know, ANZUP has and is evolving to more of a model where we're also looking at being able to do more internally and not have to rely on other entities, institutions to undertake some of those activities for our trials. But, particularly when things like funding from foundations, which are not for profit themselves, is sometimes contingent on that funding not being able to be used for overheads. It needs to be used for direct research costs. And so when we're relying more on that type of funding, it means we can't rely on, or we can't have budgets that include those sort of institutional overheads.
Yeah. You mentioned that you are coordinating networks, both of you, I believe. But do you facilitate as well, where you provide endorsement and for trials?
I know AGITG do, because
Yeah,
they've
how do you
listed on their
recover
website.
that service? I just wondered how you recover that cost service where you're facilitating a trial rather than coordinating it. Do you embed it in the grants or use your philanthropic?
Do you mean, sorry, in terms of facilitations, so AGITG is the lead legal sponsor across all of our trials, and we have several coordination models. So we have our in-house coordination teams. So we are then the legal sponsor and the coordinator of those studies to operationalize it. And then we have an external portfolio where AGITG is a legal sponsor, but we delegate a study conduct or coordination of the study with our oversight to various coordinating centres, academic coordinating centres or CROs. So we have two different models. And when it comes to the grant applications, we indicate what the coordination model will be.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And same for ANZUP.
Yeah.
Whatever the real costs are, they're the costs that go into the budget when it's built.
Built in. So it's very important to budget appropriately to support the networks.
Absolutely. And I have to say, this is something that AGITG has really had to learn the hard way. And so a lot of time was spent revising the budget policy because there were so many gaps just from that activity, because it's probably the most crucial activity to ensure the sustainability of the organization, let alone the sponsor oversight activities are being conducted, GCP compliance, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of flow-on effects, deficits, how those deficits will be funded, study assumptions, everything has to be taken into consideration during that budget development process and how that study will be funded, and any contingencies in case of deficits.
Yeah. I have a question on the, I'll go to them actually, and then come back to my follow-up question if need be. We have one from Candace. We're in the process of setting up costs for the services we provide as a facilitating network. Any advice for working out acceptable market rates for setting up these costs? Great question. We're having the same thing, so we're at that stage as well. So I know the answer too.
I mean, I guess that comes down to us understanding what our set costs are. So, what are the costs for us as a sponsor of providing insurance and indemnity for clinical trial participants? We know what that is. What is the cost of having one of our project managers? So we've got 3 project managers and a clinical trials assistant. What's the cost of having a project manager resourced into managing or overseeing a clinical trial for 5 years at 0.2 FTE in the first year and 0.3 in the second, et cetera, et cetera. So they're things that we can actually embed into our budgets because we know all of those costs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have, I think it's a comment as well from Belinda. Thanks, Jenn and Nisha, for your presentation today. Funding for our important trials is hard. Trying to get a bigger slice of the funding pie is a challenge. Well done. I think that's more of a compliment, but I think it's a sentiment we all agree with. Yeah.
It really is, and I'm happy to share offline any tools or sort of policies that we've developed in case that might be of help to other CTNs as well.
I think I'd be very interested in your budget policy. Actually, if you're happy to share, that would be absolutely wonderful.
No problem.
And actually, as a last question, if we don't have any others, I don't want to. Oh, wait a minute, one more. No, this can be last one, if we have to finish on the at 4:30. How do we manage the difference between what NHMRC reimbursed for operation staff versus actual costs? Oh, another good one.
I think that's where all those other avenues of funding come into play. You know, yes, if you've applied for NHMRC or MRFF funding, you know that there's a standard price that you can put on staffing resource in those grant budgets. So that's where I think being a centre or centres like ours, we do have the ability to feed other funding into a trial to cover the real costs, even though sometimes that funding can be hard to come by. So, you know, please support me riding my bike for 111 your way.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to finish off, I'm going to go back and follow up. You said you had learnings from your budget policy. What was the most important learning you could share with us all, or in your overall fundraising experience? What's the most important learning you can share with the Signet or with our members?
I think the more people that are involved in decision making within your organization understand the business and understand how the budget has been developed is crucial. And that was a gap that we were able to identify. We did a gap analysis last year, and this was something that arose through that process, that there was inadequate understanding of how the study budgets need to be developed. And often the study budgets are developed by operations staff. And for the most part, certainly from our group, it was sort of clear that the clinical members that sit on the committees don't necessarily have a thorough understanding of the operational costs and how the budgets are developed. So we have, you know, the assumptions. However, you know, studies are expensive these days. We can't do studies for $1 million in this day and age, where there's drug intervention and if there's shipping costs and, you know, translational research where there are, you know, more shipments than the annual shipment or something like that. So I think it's just that the more training and education and the more they're involved in how the budgets are developed is probably the key learning that we had. And then also to essentially not take on new ideas or not implement new ideas without considering the resource implication, because that then also feeds into complications down the track. So for example, with our grants, yes, we went ahead and applied to get the MRFF eligible organisation status and NHMRC status, but we do need someone within the team that can focus on grants, that have that skill set and experience. So we're lucky that we do, but there's no backup for her. So, you know, if in the event that she's unwell or on leave, then, you know, there's huge challenges there because there's no one else within the team that can support the grant application process to the level that she can. So I think it comes back down to ensuring there's appropriate and sufficient staffing that can support these income generation activities for the organisation and to ensure the company is sustainable at the end of the day. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisha. Jennifer, you have anything to add?
No, I pretty much think Nisha has spoken to it. All that learning that Nisha shared, that's something I'm sure is common with ANZUP in terms of budgets. Budgets are developed by our operational team, myself and others, and our clinicians are hugely experienced and amazing at what they do in caring for people. But they sometimes don't understand what the real costs are for running those trials. So yes, it's being able to, I think, again, bring everybody together around the table so that everybody has a mutual understanding and can get over that initial shock horror at, you know, what do you mean that trial's going to cost $4 million or $4.2 million? Why? You know, and we can usually explain why.
Thank you so much, Nisha and Jennifer. I'd like to sincerely thank on behalf of everyone for your wonderful presentations. They were so instrumental, so valuable to all our progression in the future with our clinical trials. So thank you for your time, but I also want to take the time to thank ACTA for hosting this masterclass, which I'm sure we're going to go back and revisit and watch the recordings and the learnings moving forward. But in particular, thank you to Sarah and Vivian who have helped organise this workshop for all your work as well. So yeah, and also additional the people and funding partners who support the centre and the trials, and various CTN EOs who experience contributions to their collective body of knowledge. So thank you to everyone as well. Thank you.